Welcome to the International Masters of Gaming Law's webinar. Today our topic is challenges facing the UK gambling industry during the current pandemic and beyond. My name is Mark Ellinger. I'm the president of the International Masters of Gaming Law, the IMGL. Looking forward to today's panel and looking forward to these continuing webinars that we're doing on an ongoing basis. It's my pleasure to introduce today as the moderator of our panel, Jeremy Phillips. Jeremy is of counsel of FTB Chambers and is unique amongst UK gaming lawyers. Not only did he end the first half of his career heading an international team in global practice at Evershed Sutherland, then he started an entirely new life as a self-employed barrister in the Inner Temple of London. Within just 14 years of being appointed Queen's Counsel, I think you're going to find that his topic is fascinating, his expertise is fascinating.
That's great. That's great. Thanks very much. Well, yeah, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for that, Mark. Kind introduction. Good morning to everyone over in whatever part of the United States you're in. 8 o'clock, I know, for our host, Brian at IMGL. Good afternoon to all those over here in the UK, as well as the rest of Europe. I think we're still technically in for a few more months anyway. We've got people I know joining us from the Netherlands, Denmark, Germany, Gibraltar, and also we're joined by people from Malta, I've seen on the list, India, and even a very late nighter from my old firm in Hong Kong. So we're topping 130, I know, and numbers still joining. So welcome to everyone. I hope what will be a very interesting, rewarding discussion today, and a unique opportunity, as I see it, for the industry to engage directly and live with its regulator in the event that we've timed for best access across the States, Europe, and the Far East. So it's fair to say that gambling has rarely been higher on the agenda here in the UK. It's topped these days only by news on the latest coronavirus headlines or the tweets from our political leaders. And I'm delighted to be joined here today by three individuals who are perfectly placed to explain what's really going on behind the scenes. Firstly, in the bottom left of my screen, I'm not sure if it's the same for everyone, Neil McArthur. Neil is the Chief Executive of the Gambling Commission, who's, for those who don't know, overseas is the principal regulator for all gambling in the UK. Neil became the Commission's Chief Executive in 2018, having originally joined some 12 years earlier as its first General Counsel. During that time, he's overseen the development of the Commission's regulatory framework, the evolution of its approach to licensing, enforcement and compliance, and also its merger now with the National Lottery Commission. Next, top right of my screen, we've got Brigid Simmonds, OBE. Brigid is the chair of the Betting and Gaming Council, which represents some 90% of the industry operating betting shops, online gambling and casinos. Brigid has had an illustrious career in public service, previously chief exec of the British Beer and Pub Association, 10 years before that of the umbrella organisation, Business and Sport and Leisure. Brigid is also vice president of the Sport and Recreation Alliance, board member of the Tourism Alliance, and a member of the government's Future High Streets Forum. Particularly important, I would imagine, at the moment. In June 2006, Brigid was awarded an OBE for services in sport. A little known fact here is that Brigid was previously a director of Leicester City Football Club. Brigid, I don't know whether you claim any credit for Leicester's spectacular win in 2016?
Sadly not, and I wish they were doing a little better just at the moment.
And then last but by no means least, we're joined by Andrew Tait, who's presently in Gibraltar, where he's a partner in InceGD. Andrew has served on both sides of the fence, as it were. He was previously 10 years in-house in Gibraltar, and then since then he's done another 3 years in private practice, both in London and now back with his family in Gibraltar, which all puts him in very good stead, I think, to comment when it comes to understanding and advising on the operational commercial impacts of gambling regulation. Andrew also is covering his bets, very cleverly, having dual nationality of with an Irish and a British passport. So he reckons that's going to make it easier for him to cross the border legally, I assume, as and when and if maybe we come out of Europe. I'll just mention briefly, there was the final advertised panelist, which was Ed Traynor, who's Group General Counsel at Flutter, headquartered in Ireland. Unfortunately, Ed had to pull out at the very last minute for personal reasons. He does apologise sincerely, but I'm sure any gaps remaining will be covered by our panel members. So for those of you who are viewing this, there is obviously a Q&A function at the bottom centre of your screen. If you have any questions arising during the course of this, do please raise those there, and one or other of us will field that question. And I'd just lastly say, before I do hand over to our panellists, that everything said today will be subject to Chatham House Rules. That is that participants are free to use the information received, but shouldn't reveal either the identity or the affiliation of any speaker who makes those particular comments. So that's all that I will say at the moment, and then I'll hand over from there to Neil McArthur. Thank you, Neil.
Thanks, Jeremy, and hello, everybody. I'm going to have an attempt at sharing my screen, so bear with me. Because what I really want to do, and hopefully you're able to see now a set of slides, which I'm just going to rattle through the first few of. Can you see those okay, Jeremy? Yeah.
That's fine. You don't know if you can enlarge it, but it can certainly be seen.
Let me see if I can actually start the slideshow properly. Is that a bit better?
That's better, you got it. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. So there's a very few slides that I just wanted to run through in terms of setting the challenge from the Gambling Commission's perspective. And the first is really to try and set the scenes around the Commission's current priorities. So I thought it would probably be useful to do a little bit of scene setting over the next 2 or 3 slides to say how gambling is in the UK. This first slide shows gross gambling yield over the past number of years. What you see in that is 3 interesting things. Gross gambling yield going up year on year, but starting to level out. And I should say that some of that increase around 2014-15 was the point where the law was changed to move to a point of consumption regulation regime, which now means that the Gambling Commission regulates all gambling to consumers in Great Britain. So you've seen gross gambling yield going up, but almost entirely driven by online gambling increases. Premises-based stable, lotteries broadly stable. What you see in overall terms is participation in gambling going down, and that is offset to an extent by the fact that online participation rates are increasing. But overall, participation in gambling in the UK is going down, and the headline of that is, from a regulator's perspective, that means, accepted at face value, and obviously the world's much more complicated than that, that more money is being taken from fewer consumers, and that is why consumer safety is absolutely at the forefront of all the debates in the UK. The next is a question of consumer behaviour. Consumers are in the UK increasingly moving to playing on their mobile phone, and they're increasingly moving to playing slots. And what you see is the shift in behaviour in terms of the device being used on the left-hand side of this slide, and on the right you see the growth in gross gambling yield from slots. And that's important because it changes the profile of the risk to the player. The third bit, which Jeremy hinted at a moment ago, is this whole question of the scrutiny of regulation in Great Britain. There have been 3 parliamentary reports in the last month that touch on gambling regulation. And the headlines, once again, and I'm summarising many hundreds of pages into a single slide here, there's a particular focus on online gambling. There's a real question about Gambling Commission's effectiveness and how we are funded and how we keep track with developments in the industry. There's a real focus around gambling related harm. There's a question about how consumers get redress. And then there's an argument about the extent to which gambling advertising and marketing needs to be restricted or changed. So they're the kind of headlines of all the scrutiny, but the Commission is undoubtedly facing a lot of scrutiny at the minute. And then the final chart in terms of data, which to an extent shapes the scrutiny we're under, is this one here, which shows that year on year, consumer confidence in gambling has been in decline. And we would like to see that decline shifted and consumers have greater trust in gambling. But I think partly because of the narrative that is taking place in Britain at the minute, that that is a significant challenge, and you can see that challenge set out in this chart. And I think that creates a challenge for both operators and the regulator in terms of getting a balance. So then that's the preamble. In terms of current priorities, I just wanted to talk about 4 big areas for us at the minute. One is a real push around responsible game and product design. And that is really about the fact that as consumers move towards slots, we want to be sure that those kind of products are safe for consumers. There's the question of the incentivization of high value customers or VIPs. I know that we're going to talk about that later. There's how you can use advertising technology and technology generally to protect consumers, which is a big priority. And then last but by no means least, there's a real continued push for us around knowing your customer and affordability as a protective mechanism. And the final thing that I would just say is important, and then I will stop screen sharing, is given the increasingly global nature of online gambling, and given that all of us in this space are wrestling with the question, how do you balance consumer choice and enjoyment against the risks and harm that gambling can present to some people in some circumstances, is just to say that we're very actively involved with regulators all over the world to share experience, share knowledge and intelligence about what's working. And that's another area of real focus. So that's all I really wanted to say at this point, Jeremy. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing at that point.
Excellent. Well, thanks very much, Neil. That's very succinct and yeah, good introduction to what you want to say. Brigid, can I ask you perhaps to just to say a few words?
Yes, of course. So I haven't got slides, but if I could just talk about the Betting and Gaming Council. So as Jeremy said, we were set up in 2019. We actually are a combination of 3 trade associations. So we used to have the Remote Gambling Association, which is online, the Association of British Bookmakers, the National Casino Forum. So they have all come together. So we represent 90% of the industry. I think it's worth pointing out what we don't represent. So we don't represent arcades and we don't represent the National Lottery. And our clear objectives are about raising standards in safer gambling. We're very keen to work with the government, with the Gambling Commission, with our stakeholders and with our customers, obviously. And the objectives, which we launched sort of last November, were about managing the appropriate use of advertising in the industry. And we have the whistle-to-whistle ban, which actually reduced the number of, the amount of advertising on television substantially, probably by over 80% in the last year. So you can't show sports betting advertisements 5 minutes before and 5 minutes after the game actually begins, or indeed at half time. And I think the importance of that is an understanding of exactly how advertising works in the UK. So you actually, during the day before the 9 PM watershed, can only advertise National Lottery and bingo, and sports betting is only allowed around live sport. And I think that was an important change that we've made. It's very much about championing the protection and education of young people, and we announced a 10 million fund to YGAM and GamCare, which is particularly around education, which I think is important. Maintaining the highest staff and training standards, and championing the community value, because I do think, and the House of Lords report was very clear, that there is a community value to betting and gaming in the UK. And we launched with 22 commitments on safer gambling. I'll talk a little later about some of the priorities and the work that we're doing, but much of it mirrors what Neil has already mentioned. We announced 100 million to RET over the next 4 years earlier this year. We have a code of conduct on VIPs. We're working on sports sponsorships, on affiliates, on sharing data. And I think, Jeremy, that's probably enough for me as an introduction.
That's excellent. Thank you very much, Brigid. And then lastly, Andrew, over to you for me.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jeremy. I suppose I'll kind of focus a little bit more on the global gambling aspects, because the UK is a very important market, the largest online gaming market in the world, but our clients obviously have other jurisdictions they need to consider. And we've seen the last 13 years or so since I've been involved, a kind of move from the unregulated to the regulated global markets. And of course, that is a great headache for operators who have, compliance team needed to oversee all different types of jurisdictions and very different compliance regimes in each one. So again, with that change, there's been an expansion in compliance teams and complexity. So that is a huge driver for businesses now to make sure they have the right people in the right places, and there's sufficient oversight by senior management. And of course, this obviously is a key driver to the business going forward as to which markets operators can enter and maybe which markets they exit. We see the UK Gambling Commission as the kind of the gold standard in terms of compliance and regulation. It has numerous reports, consultations, documentations, enforcement publications to allow operators to really understand what's required of them and what kind of standards they need to sort of achieve, which is very important for a lot of operators to know that. And many operators will use the UK as a sort of a generic regime to cover many other jurisdictions, especially around money laundering and responsible gambling. Because given that the standards expected, most jurisdictions will be covered within those standards. I think it's very important from my point of view and from my clients is that the Gambling Commission continues to be collaborative with the industry. It's very important that not only does it enforce and make sure that those standards are maintained, but also that it collaborates with the industry. And I saw in the National Audit Report, was a quote saying from industry representatives who were interviewed that they wanted more clarity from the Commission about its expectations and a more collaborative relationship to help raise standards. So I think it's important that the regulator and the industry do collaborate and perhaps look at sort of workshops or practical sessions where they can really understand how to implement those requirements, not just what the requirements are. And there's some examples of this which you can see quite clearly. And the last four out of the last four enforcements concerned money laundering, and the key aspect of that was their failure to carry out appropriate risk assessments. So in PTS, Caesars, Betway, and Mr. Green, this was at the root of the failure to comply with money laundering regulations. I think the Gambling Commission could work with the industry more to really help it understand what is the expectation in terms of risk assessment, what should they look like, how should they work, allow the industry to sort of be open to tools and guidance that can be shared across the operator base. And obviously with some operators being much smaller, some operators based in Malta or elsewhere who don't necessarily have the UK as their main market, they really need to understand what's expected. And I would be quite happy myself to work with the Gambling Commission and maybe host a workshop around AML risk assessment to kind of demonstrate the tools, methodologies, and samples of the way of achieving a good comprehensive risk assessment. And I think that kind of practical guidance would go a long way for the industry and the regulator to work together.
Right. Well, throwing the gauntlet down there. Thank you, Andrew. That's interesting. Well, before we get into some of the discussions and topics I know we were going to cover, Neil, do you want to chip in on that now, or maybe leave it later on? Basically, the issue, I think, as Andrew was articulating, of possibly sometimes quite smaller businesses how they deal with AML, which is essentially a global problem affecting us all and every regulator. Don't know if you have any views on that, Neil, or whether we deal with that later on. We have other discussions on the agenda.
I mean, I'm happy to deal with it very briefly now, if that would help. And so we're extremely keen, and probably have people on the call have heard me say before that the Commission will be tough in terms of regulating and enforcing and compliance and enforcement activity, but we're also extremely keen to find ways to collaborate and give guidance and help things go right in the first place. And we do a fair amount of workshop style activity with smaller operators in Great Britain. To pick on one of the examples that was put, we did take a team out to Malta to run workshops there. It's the sort of activity that we're very keen, because ultimately, and I don't get a lot of plaudits for this at times, but ultimately we're prepared to work with absolutely anybody who can help make things better for consumers and keep consumers safer. So very keen to keep doing that, always against the backdrop which, once again, all of the reports have identified, which is there not being a limitless supply of resource available to the Commission to do things. So we do have to do some prioritising.
Thank you. Brigid, I suppose this is something you're less involved in as the industry representative.
I always think it's difficult for a regulator. Regulators are there to regulate. They're not there to be too friendly with the industry. And it's getting that balance right, which I think is important. But we have regular discussions, or the team do, particularly with Neil. And I think that's as it should be. And we have done our best. I mean, Neil launched a whole series of consultations with the industry with specific companies who were initially in the lead, but that was really before the BGC was set up. We're now hosting most of that work going forward on safer gambling, and as indeed we should be. So it's getting that balance right, but I think when it works, it obviously can work well.
Great. No, thank you. Now, we were going to talk, I know one of the topics that we were asked to address briefly was the issue of how COVID-19 has impacted everyone in the industry, and how particularly it's affected the gambling industry, both from an operational and a compliance point of view. So just on that, I don't know, Brigid, whether you've got much feedback that you can share with us from the industry on that?
I mean, this has been an extremely hard time for everyone, wherever they've been working. But initially, obviously, we were all closed. We've managed to get betting shops, bingo, back up and running. And obviously, sport is there, which helps the online. But we'd struggled with casinos. But luckily, well, not luckily, I actually came up to London to visit a casino with representatives from the Cabinet Office, DCMS, and medical officers, and go and look at exactly how they were going to keep people safe. And I think it's great that the government have announced that they're going to be able to open from the 1st of August. So it's the end of next week. And initially I'd have said we were 50 to 60% down. And obviously with no sports betting, that was really very difficult. And the BGC recognised the concerns right from the beginning that we would have vulnerable people sitting at home. And the last thing we wanted to do was to encourage them to take part in gambling inappropriately. So we launched a 10-point plan. It encouraged our members to make sure their safer gambling messages were very clear, to intervene more, to make sure that they were encouraging people to set deposit limits. And we've continued that. And we then stopped all advertising for about a month. And even now it's come back. 20% of your advertisements have to be around safer gambling messages. So we have tried to do everything that we can with our members, and Neil mentioned sort of advertising technology and some of the work we're doing there. I mean, the last thing you should be able to do, and we work with many of the online platforms, if you Google board, the last thing that should come up with is gambling. It's been really hard on the industry. I think one of the Q&As was about about the number of betting shops that perhaps are concentrated on the high street. You know, we've closed 1,400 betting shops so far, which has partly been due to the change in FOBTs. But there will be a number of premises in the industry that will struggle to remain open going forward. And you know, we're not out of this yet. Getting consumer confidence, we're signed up to the Visit Britain, You're Good to Go campaign, which is about encouraging people to come back to their high streets. But for those of us who go out and about, there are very few people about. When I went up to Leicester, I came into Victoria Station, I walked to Leicester Square. If I saw 50 people, I'd be surprised. So, you know, it's very empty, and I think it will be until people really feel safe to come out, and that will continue to affect the industry.
Great. No, thank you for that. And congratulations on the casinos. Again, it's obviously a worldwide problem. It's affecting everybody, and that's a really good initiative, and hopefully that's replicated everywhere else. Neil, from the Commission's perspective, obviously you're monitoring the stats all the time and the trends. What would you say are the kind of headline?
Well, let me have a go at sharing my screen if I can. And
yeah, we got that.
Okay, can you see that?
Yeah, good.
So I just wanted to share, there's 2 or 3 slides. Firstly, this is the data from May 2020, and you know, in many respects, what the headlines of the data that we've been gathering have been, you know, an acceleration in changes we're already seeing, driven by the practical realities that there was no premises-based gambling and there was no sport to do online sports betting on. And so what you see is the data showing on this slide, you know, the spend in GGY per customer. It's just one way of cutting it, but I think what it's showing, I think it shows, is why we're so interested in not just online, but the particular products people are playing. And obviously during COVID, what we saw was a significant drop off in betting, including online. And obviously, you know, I wasn't left in any doubt. I spoke to a lot of the trade association and operators, chief executives, as we went into lockdown, about the devastating impact that lockdown would have on premises-based gambling. And I've been in touch with Brigid's colleagues at the BGC and with the Bingo Association and BACTA, as well as lots of operators, chief executives throughout, to keep track of it. And we've been trying to work really closely with operators to help where we could, but recognizing that the Commission's ability to change things, even like things like, you know, we couldn't waive fees and things. We did what we could. The next slide I just wanted to check is we've obviously been tracking what consumer behaviour has been doing during March through to May, and looking at that on this through the lens of, you know, the GGY per active player. And what we were actually seeing was that overall player numbers were down, but the most engaged gamblers were doing more gambling, and we need to be mindful of that, because, you know, this is changing the risk profile, and it just raises questions that we all need to be mindful of, alongside the ones that I know that the, you know, operators and the industry were keen to address, like what do you do about people who are feeling, you know, isolated, bored, vulnerable, and how do you keep them safe? So we've been looking at that. In terms of actions, obviously we, on the first cut of the data, did take some action in terms of tightening the protections that we were expecting. You know, I know that some of the people I expect on this call raised a quizzical eyebrow at how we went about doing some of this through changing guidance, and we took the conscious decision to do that because we needed to make changes quickly, and we are consulting in terms of the permanence of some of these arrangements, and have other plans to consult in the longer term. But what we did do was make it really clear that we expected reverse withdrawals to stop, so that people who wanted their money didn't get tempted during that period between asking for the withdrawal and the cash returning, and we introduced a range of other measures besides. So that's the action that we've taken. What we have done is try and base all of our decision making through this period during the lockdown on data, and we've been very pleased with the way the industry have cooperated in giving us the data. But the headline of it is that none of us know quite how the industry is going to emerge, and we're obviously very mindful of the news that we're seeing of closures as lockdown eases. So there were announcements last week that we saw from both the casino and the bingo sector, and we're tracking that really closely. So once again, I'm going to stop sharing at that point, Jeremy, but that's where we're at in relation to that thing.
No, thank you. That's very, very, very useful to see that. Andrew, I don't know if you've got a quick comment before we get on to the main issue, which is we were going to talk about, which is the VIP programs. Anything particular on COVID, or is that not especially crossed your desk?
Well, I mean, obviously, as mentioned, the change, I suppose, in behaviour once sports betting closed down virtually over the period. So real events were no longer accessible. So people switched to virtual games and esports. Now, that was mentioned on the slide, esports. And as real games came back on, real sports events came back on, people sort of stopped playing virtual games, but I think still continue to play or bet on esports. And that's kind of a interesting area. I think the Gambling Commission released last week a report on esports over the period, and it's grown 124% between March and April, which is huge. And I think year to year, it was over 1,000% increase in betting on esports from March to March. And I think that this is an area which will continue to grow despite the end of the shutdown. And I think this is an area which is very sensitive, because esports itself has betting integrity issues, which obviously need to be looked at. But also, irrespective of betting on esports themselves have a lot of issues around things like loot boxes, which are being picked up by the House of Lords and others. And in that recent report, there was a Dr. Zendel, I think he was, who basically said that the link between problem gambling and loot boxes was extraordinarily robust. In fact, it was of a magnitude that's uncommon in social sciences. So there's a clear link between people who pay for loot boxes, and many of them are very young. So they will be doing it as a gaming activity. It's not gambling, and then they could, as a result of those loot boxes, which is based on a random number generator, they could get a benefit from that, and potentially, sometimes they can trade those benefits. There could be skins or in-play items. And that in itself is a big concern. So, and I think the Gambling Commission and others have published reports around esports and the dangers of esports, and the way of esports being a way in for younger players to turn into gamblers, which I think is a thing to look at and keep an eye on. And we'll see how that will change in the future, and if the UK will follow other countries in banning loot boxes. So that was one observation I got.
No, thanks for that. Thanks for that. Okay. Well, I think on that basis, if we move on to, I know an area that we were going to be talking about, which is VIP programs, very much on the top of everybody's agenda, not only the Commission in any event, but also the House of Lords report that Andrew just mentioned. And I'm sure Brigid's been very engaged in it as well. So, Neil, how would you express the Commission's view on VIP programs at the moment? Well,
as I put up on the slide a minute ago, it is an area of significant focus for us, and I think the reason we're focused on it and the linked question of affordability, frankly, is because it's been too prominent a feature of regulatory failings over a number of years, and we need to address it. This is not the legitimate treatment of high rollers who can afford to and understand the risks involved in gambling significant sums. The cases that we get involved in are people where too little has been asked. They are not really VIPs. They are people who are in difficulties and then being treated as VIPs based on spend rather than being based on their ability to spend, whether they can afford the money, the source of the money, the links with AML, etc. So it's a very important area for us to fix. We're very focused on it. We can't just keep going along regulating after the event. We need to address this. I've heard operators, CEOs describe VIPs as a toxic issue, and I think they're right to describe it in those terms. And I think fixing the treatment of VIPs would be a massive step forward, both in terms of the protection of consumers, but would really go a long way to addressing the trust and confidence point that has also been in decline.
Okay, thank you. I mean, you say that's not the legitimate treatment of high rollers. I'm sure you accept in many cases it is. In fact, probably in the vast majority of cases it is. The issue is, I suppose, that the cases you see, almost by definition, are the cases where something's gone off the rails and it hasn't been used for legitimate purposes. I don't know, Brigid, what feedback and comments you've had from the industry on that.
When I took the 5 CEOs in front of the House of Lords, we were absolutely clear that we have not been best in class in the past and that we needed to do much more work in this area. And in fact, we've now published a code. That code comes into effect on the 30th of September. It's slightly later for retail. It's 3 months from reopening. But you have to pass now rigorous and robust checks in relation to safer gambling. You have to, somebody on the board or a senior executive has to be in charge of it. There has to be ongoing monitoring, spending has to be sustainable, and you can't be under the age of 25 unless you're personally signed off by someone who is really very senior, and you wouldn't expect that many VIPs, or I suppose a few footballers, to be fitting into that. But you have to have verified your customer identity, you need to know your occupation and profession and establish where their income is generated from. And any reward program has to have a clear line of oversight and accountability, and it has to be overseen by someone on the board who has a personal management license. And no individual incentives or hospitality unless this goes to a high proportion of the customer base. Commercial pressures should never override welfare considerations, must be conducted with clear, consistent, transparent, good practice. So it is an area that we're very concerned about. It's an area where that code is now active. And I'm absolutely certain that we will continue to have discussions with Neil if that wasn't considered to be good enough over the fullness of time. But it's something that we need to do, and affordability, I feel, is a term that's used by many. Affordability has got to be looked at in more detail, and one of the things that I thought was very helpful from the House of Lords report was it suggested that the Information Commissioner was prepared to allow us to share a lot more information between companies. So if somebody closes down a company account, can they share that information with other people, and the banks were able to share more information with us. So I definitely would hope that that DCMS, who obviously the Information Commissioner is responsible to them too, would be coming forward to engage with some discussions with us on that. But as you know, we're also going to have a review of the Gambling Act in the UK. I'm sure that discussion will be part of that. And we are keen that that review takes place sooner rather than later.
Excellent. No, I can understand that. And I think the point you made about having somebody on the board is absolutely critical, isn't it? Because if you've got a more junior person who is subject to commercial pressures of their own or promotional pressures, they may not be willing necessarily to say the unacceptable or the hard thing to the board. So you need somebody.
I think that's absolutely vital. And when I agreed to take this job, I had these discussions with every one of the CEOs of the big companies, and they were absolutely clear that their shareholders were saying to them, you have got to do something about the reputation of the industry, and you've got to do more and take more responsibility. And that goes through every single company now, and I would hope as a result that Neil will see less cases, although I also welcome an idea that we have a proper ombudsman. I mean, we already have IBAS and others who look at whether something is fair or not in betting, but I think if there needs to be something perhaps that looks at behaviour, but we need to be clear how that would work and how it would be paid for.
Yeah, thank you. And Andrew, again, from somebody who's been both in the industry but also now turned poacher and representing operators, how do you see VIP programs and you know, the extent to which it's actually a live issue going forward?
I suppose, I mean, the term VIP is kind of misconstrued in many cases. You know, it's anyone who basically is given that status to enable them to be given some sort of bonus or incentives to play. And I think the first thing that has been done is to clarify what VIP should be defined as, and create a kind of an entry door around VIP programs. So the Betting and Gaming Council and the Gambling Commission in its consultation has set out, you know, clear definitions which the industry can use to define what a VIP is. So it's someone who is going to get some real benefit for that. And that will, I think, enable the operators to clear up their VIP programs and maybe reduce the levels or layers of VIPs that they have, which is often sort of complex and hard for anyone to understand, to focus on those who really can afford to enter that program. And before they can enter that program, they'll have to pass these entry requirements, which is important, because at that point you're ensuring that at least at the beginning of the relationship, you have carried out sufficient background checks to understand their affordability and to determine if they have any personal issues which would make them more vulnerable to that. So it's very important that it's done, and that has to be done retrospectively for those types of players. The other thing, obviously, is that means the remaining players still have to undergo affordability checks. So just because this is a VIP consultation initiative, it doesn't basically mean that all the others are under a lesser test. Those other players still have to go through affordability checks, and operators need to make sure they understand the differences and try to sort of build in their processes some form of automation or ways of them to sort of look at spend for players across a huge volume of players and see if they can start to sort of understand which players at what point they can afford to continue to play. So it's going to be difficult for operators to implement these measures. They have some time to do that, and I think some have already got a good head start with the code of conduct already being published. They've got a good head start, and it'll be crucial for the industry because this is a huge area of profitability, with some operators taking, you know, over 80% of their profits from this small group of players. So it's crucial that they get it right and they educate the players themselves as to the expectations. So those players will need to understand that to become a VIP, they're going to have to, you know, expose themselves to more information requests. You know, they're going to have to make sure that they understand the reasons behind those requests, and they're going to have to work closely with the operator to ensure that, you know, any kind of ongoing monitoring that happens, any interactions that happen, are for a good reason. And I think, you know, players will become more educated and understand that gambling, you know, is a entertainment pastime, but also has, you know, a risk, and that they should always sort of think, you know, step back a little bit, and with the help of the operator, make sure that they are on a safe path. So it's a question of this collaboration between the player and the industry, and also the industry themselves becoming much more aware of how to implement these measures. And, you know, we'll see with the different technologies that are out there today, how those technologies can help operators really understand affordability and make sure that they cover that in the best possible way.
Thank you. No, that, I mean, as you say, it's a question of collaboration, and if they are to be seen as VIPs by the company, then they need to work with the company to ensure that the company can safely give that privilege without being seen to be exploitative. So no, that's a good point. Just moving on there, really interesting topic. I see that we've got a question from, I don't quite know how to pronounce it, Dom Conch. Apologise, Dom, if I got your surname wrong. Neil, I don't know if you've seen this. It's coming from a certain angle. How will the Commission ensure that going forward the industry is not the subject of knee-jerk regulation, etc.? Have you had a look at that, and is there anything you'd want to say about that?
Well, isn't that the challenge for for everybody? It is a risk that regulator, all regulators, and the gambling regulator possibly more than others, it runs the risk of being buffeted around. Now, I'm determined that we don't get buffeted around by events to any great extent. That's not the same as not being agile or not being responsive to issues. I think the answer lies in two things in particular, and we've made good progress on one but not the other. Evidence is key, and the evidence base that underpins regulatory decision making is something in an area where I think we really have made decent progress, and that's important. And there, when you have evidence and you have good evidence, that allows you to make decisions using your judgment about what you should do. So the bit I would push back in the question is the sense that what we did on the May 12th was knee-jerk. What we did on May 12th was in the light of the evidence we had, needing to do something urgently in a time that wasn't typical. But I don't accept that what we did in May 12th was knee-jerk. We could, of course, have done a 3-month consultation and a 3-month notice period, and we could have implemented a change sometime in early 2021. We took the judgment that that wasn't the best thing for consumers at that point, but it wasn't knee-jerk. However, the knee-jerk risk does exist also where you can't demonstrate the impact of the things you're doing. And that is an area where the Commission has acknowledged that it needs to do more and do better. So I think the answer to the risk of being buffeted around is to have the best evidence that you can articulate. And we have made progress. I mean, just to give you a real example, the House of Lords report is largely based, not completely, but largely based in data from the Gambling Commission. Candidly, that has not always been the case for public policy decisions around gambling. So that is progress. We are increasingly seen as the point for reliable information and evidence about gambling. The next step for the Commission is to address the whole question of, are the things you're doing effective? And we've got work in place to do that. We've got more plans. And between those two, I think that is the answer to just being buffeted around by the events of the day.
That's great. Thank you very much. It's very comprehensive. I don't know, Brigid, any come back on that? Don't feel you obliged.
No, I mean, the only thing I would say, particularly about the House of Lords report, and I think it's important that we say this, I think there was confusion about some of the stats around children. And you know, Andrew's talked about esports and loot boxes. I don't have any members who offer any of those to anyone who is under the age of 18. And it would be almost impossible to sign up to one of our members' accounts these days if you were under the age of 18, and you know, unless there was a. So I think there's a bit of confusion to me in some of the areas and the statistics that they looked at there. And it's a decision for the government whether they do something about either loot boxes or about esports, but at the moment they're not obviously under the there's obviously the misuse bill which could be used for that purpose, but at the moment they're not under they don't come under the Gambling Act, and more to the point, they're not operated by members of the BGC.
Right, thank you. I'm going to keep these short now because we've got a flurry of questions. I just want to do a kind of quick fire thing, you know, a sentence or two. First one come in, might be a question for Andrew. What do you see as the future role of affiliates in the UK gambling industry? Presumably the implication there, to what extent should they be brought into the remit of the Commission and regulated in a greater degree than they are? Any quick comments on that?
Well, I think there's a growing consensus that they should be regulated, that should be accountable for their own actions, and the operators who employ them or contract with them shouldn't be held responsible for some of the more maverick affiliates. So I think they should be, and I think they themselves originally, you know, opposed this, and now they seem to, or their associations seem to be in favour of themselves being regulated. So
Okay,
that's where to go.
thank you. And then Neil, would you wish to comment, or you might want to reserve your thoughts? I don't know. Any quick comment on that?
I'm holding operators responsible for what their affiliates do, so I'm pretty clear where our lines are drawn.
Okay.
And actually, Jeremy, you know, the Affiliates Association had already said that they are looking at a code. It's something that we put forward to the House of Lords. We were quite happy for there to be a code, and we'll play our part in producing that or helping with it.
Okay, thank you. Another quick one from Stephen Ketley, who I'm sure we all know. And really picking up the point that Neil just raised about the use of evidence, and how evidence was very important in the House of Lords report recently. But Stephen's asking, how important is it to hear not just the voice of consumers who experienced harm, but also the regular punter who enjoys gambling and does not experience such problems? And I know that was mentioned by the Lords, that gambling is a very great source of enjoyment by many people without harm. But Neil, quickly, and then maybe Brigid. I can see Brigid eager to answer.
So the quick answer is that challenge, how to balance consumer choice and enjoyment for most against the risk that gambling presents to some.
Yeah,
it's all the way back, way past the Budd report. It appears in almost every business plan and annual report the Commission has ever published. It always will be the challenge, and we're determined to address it. The short answer to the question, how important is the consumer voice who just enjoys gambling? Very important. We've done quite a lot of work of our own through 2CV to understand the motivations and what people's experience of gambling is for the leisure gambler, as well as wanting to bring in the voice of lived experience. One is not more important than the other. All of the perspectives are important.
Great. Brigid.
45% of British adults gamble at least once a month, and the majority do so safely. I think the other thing we need to think about is the contribution that gambling makes. I mean, for example, I spent part of the morning on a call talking about horse racing. I mean, horse racing probably wouldn't exist, or greyhound racing in this country, if it wasn't for the 350 million that the industry puts into that sport. And look how important that is to rural communities. So, and actually, the whole world of this will not work unless we take a holistic view. So we need to work, I've already mentioned the online platforms, we need to work with the banks, we need to ensure that we've got gambling that's safe in this country but does not drive people to offshore black market sites that are completely unregulated and do not set their standards as the sort of standards that we require of BGC members. So I think that's enormously important, but I do, and I think it is rarely heard, because, and I think that's one of the problems with that, is because people are inclined to say, I won't talk about this is something that should be a hole in the corner. And I think we do need to talk about it more. We need to talk about it the same way that we talk about people drinking. And when your son or daughter goes to university, you talk about that, you need to do gambling too. Sorry, Chairman.
Yeah, well, I guess the problems always make more interesting headlines, don't they? And that's what people like to ramp up. I mean, another quick question here from my friend Audrey Ferry at Pinson's, and maybe redressing the balance a little bit. The House of Lords report is critical of the Commission, specifically in relation to the use of sanctions. Many operators would disagree. Does Neil consider there's any justification for that criticism? And say Audrey's been brave enough to put her name to that particular question.
Well, Neil. I mean, so the answer is yes and no. There is some. Well, so look, on one level,
on the fence.
On one level, I think that, you know, at a point where the people you're regulating think you're being too tough and other people think you're not being tough enough, maybe you're in the right space. Yeah. The real issue here, going back to my previous answer, is until you can demonstrate that it's having the impact you expected, you are vulnerable to the question, what difference is it making? And the question that was put to me in the House of Lords was, you're doing all of this, how do you know it's having an effect? And I could assert and use anecdote to explain it, but I'm hoping in the near future to be able to come up with better measures that demonstrate it is having the impact, because I think standards are raising. but it is difficult to do more than simply assert that.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Right. Well, I'm frustrated in one way. I'm very conscious of the time because it's run away, and to be frank, I think we could have done with maybe 2 hours at least on this, if not longer. Really fascinating, and I just love chatting to you, given that so many different angles are presented. But I'm sure that we're going to be we're going to find Mark interceding shortly. So there's a quick final question from, let me just read it. From Dan White from Synologic Innovative Solutions. Is there an appetite within the Commission to review technologies that will give regulators direct insight into the accounts of the operators when high-risk RGO-AML flags are identified?
Well, I mean, the short answer is that appetite already exists, because our compliance regime takes place on the basis of show us, don't tell us. So we ask operators to show us what they've got. The real technology opportunity, I think, which is why we did the single customer view workshop earlier in the year, and we'll want to come back to that, is how you use technology as a protective mechanism, which allows operators themselves to have access to the information they need across the piece. So I think it is a big opportunity there for everybody.
And Andrew, oh, sorry, Brigid.
No, I was just going to say one of the work streams we're working on now is on game design. So we're looking at many of those areas with the Commission and are the things that we can do. I mean, I think one of the difficulties is what is attractive to one person might be totally different to another, but there is a lot of work that's been going on in that area. And we will hopefully be doing more as we go forward.
Thank you. Andrew, I know you're a very techie kind of guy. Any quick views on that at all?
Yeah, I mean, RegCheck is key for, you know, allowing operators to scale up the checks that they need to do. It's impossible to really, looking at the affordability levels that the Gambling Commission is prescribing, could be £100 or £200 a month, you know, where you need to sort of check if they can afford that level of spend. That's a huge number of players to check, and it's only through technology you can really achieve that. And with multiple brands, multiple products, I think operators are going to have to turn to technology more. So it's key, but it can't replace, you know, the deeper dive that they have to do on the bigger spenders. But it's getting that balance right, and look at the sources of information that those technologies rely on to look at affordability. So yeah, it's key.
Great, thank you. Well, I just want to say thank you to everybody for participating. I know it seems it's only 60 minutes now, but I know there's a lot of preparation work goes into this event and on all your parts. So thank you very much for taking time out of your day. Thank you very much for everyone who's logged in from all over the parts of the world. And I hope that what you've seen and heard today has given you some additional insight into gambling in the UK from almost every perspective. Certainly the best we could do. And on that basis, I'll leave you and hand back to your president, Mark Ellinger. Thank you, Mark.
Jeremy, thank you very much. Great panel today. Really enjoyed it. Very fascinating, the developments and the status of gambling in the UK. Thanks to Jeremy, Brigid, Neil, and Andrew for really, I think, a great informative panel, one of the best we've ever had. I want to say real quickly, we have two upcoming panels. August 17th, we'll talk about labor and employment issues in the gaming industry in light of COVID. And on August 26th, we'll have esports and gambling, and I'm sure that'll have a lot to do with COVID also. The first is moderated by Daniel Berkeley, the second by Ron Seget. If you have suggestions on other topics, suggestions on speakers or moderators, please email our executive director, Brienne at imgl.org. You can always check for other updates, upcoming events at imgl.org. Again, my thanks to Jeremy for putting this together and to his great team of panelists. We look forward to seeing you all again in the very near future on August 17th. Have a great day. Thank you.